To show you the basics of projecting and trimming surfaces using curves, I'm going to take a simple cutout shape like this rear light detail and apply it to the back end of our car. So we've been creating lots of curves, but previously we also created some surfaces. So now I want to use the two together. So I'll create the cutout shape here for the rear light. So I'll just do a hide unselected to isolate this back surface, and I'll go into the back view and do a look at. And now what I want to do is draw a curve for the cutout shape. So I've got the CV curve tool on my shelf, so I'll use that to quickly trace out a shape. And I'll use the right mouse button here to keep these last few CVs vertical. And you see that I've overbuilt the curve so that it goes beyond the surface. And this is quite important when we're projecting, which I'll show you later. So that curve has been drawn on the YZ plane at the origin. But if I now want to get that shape drawn onto this surface, I can leave the curve there because I'm going to use the Project tool here on Surface Edit. And Project has a number of direction options, and View is the default. And with this, I need to go into the view that lines up the curve the way I want it. But alternatively, I could just use the X, Y, Z directions, which are independent of the view I'm using. So I'm going to do it that way and just use the X direction. And then it asks me to select the surface first, and then say Go, and then select the curve or curves, and then finally say Project. And you can see that I now have that shape drawn on the surface. And you'll notice that it's coloured green, which means it has construction history. And it's not an ordinary curve, it's called a curve on surface. And it has its own pick tool here labelled COS. So I can select that curve, and although it's still a NURBS curve, it doesn't have any CVs, it only has edit points. But that's fine because we don't actually need to be able to manipulate this directly. We just need it on the surface to define the trim region. So now I can do the trimming with the second tool on Surface Edit called Trim. And this asks me to first select the surface, and then to select the region that I want to either keep or discard. So I'm going to click this large part here and say Keep. And you can see that it's now trimmed out the shape of the light. So I've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boundaries to my surface. But if I turn on the CVs, you can see that the underlying surface structure hasn't changed. I still have a simple, disciplined CV layout. And that's what gives me the strong, clean surface highlights. Now you remember that the curve on surface was green, so it has construction history. So if I make any changes to that original curve, the trim shape will also stay updated. And it also means that if I make any changes to the surface, then the trim will always get recalculated, and the construction history will be maintained. Another useful thing about trimming is that I can always restore the surface by using the Untrim tool. And that gets me right back to my original surface. And if we wanted to go all the way back to the beginning, we could pick the curve on surface and just hit delete. But I'll just undo that so that we can continue looking at the trim tool. So I always have a choice with trim, to choose either to discard or to keep. So this time I could pick the area that I want to discard instead. And if I make a mistake, I can always do a revert. And now I just want to show you something that can easily go wrong. If I pick this CV here and just move it up, then eventually the surface untrims itself. And here you can see why. It's because the curve on surface hasn't reached the edge boundary. So it doesn't describe a closed area, and the trimming can't create a complete shape. So that was one of the reasons I made sure my curve was built comfortably beyond the surface edges. And finally, the Pick Curve on Surface tool will get used a lot, so you may want to add it to your marking menu. So I'll choose a position and I'll put it up here, which will be the last slot. So I'll remember to open the pull down menu first, and then I'll drag the tool onto the last position. And I'll just check it's in the right place, and that's fine. And then I'll tidy up the name using a control double click. And I'll just call that COS, for example. And then I mustn't forget to save that once I've made some changes. So just have a play with the project and trim tools to get used to the sequence of clicks. And then we'll use it later on to create the side of the car.